Zhang Azure NUS Sky Neural, Talk Do plus 20%, Fong Catch Energetic, Swamp Yo, Swamp Posse. Swamp welcome Swamp back to Swamp higher Swamp calling, Swamp kicking Swamp off Swamp Day Swamp 31 of Swamp R Swamp 30 Swamp Days Swamp of Swamp Swagger Swamp Faith. Swamp where Swamp here Swamp to Swamp Slay Swamp Chaos Swamp with Swamp Jesus Swamp and Swamp Today Swamp Banger Swamp is Swamp Dash Faith Swamp that Swamp eats Swamp Fear. Swamp who's Swamp ready Swamp to Swamp Sling Swamp some Swamp Fear Swamp into Swamp the Swamp. Pause, energetic laugh, Swamp yeah, Swamp that Swamp the Swamp vibe Swamp where Swamp bringing Swamp today, Swamp so Swamp buckle Swamp up Swamp and Swamp let's Swamp get Swamplet, Swamp so, Swamp weavy Swamp and Swamp riding Swamp the Swamp faith Swamp wave Swamp for Swamp 30 Swamp days Swamp straight, Swamp dropping Swamp truth Swamp bombs Swamp and Swamp lifting Swamp Jesus Swamp higher Swamp and Swamp a Swamp gator Swamp on Swamp a Swamp moonshine Swamp rampage. Swamp if Swamp you Swamp miss Swamp day Swamp 30, Swamp we Swamp rap Swamp at Swamp up Swamp with Swamp a Swamp total Swamp faith Swamp remix Swamp that Swamp slap Swamp harder Swamp than Swamp a Swamp Molotov Swamp chill bum Swamp check Swamp at Swamp bot Swamp and Swamp the Swamp playlist Swamp after Swamp this. Swamp but Swamp now, Swamp where Swamp diving Swamp head first Swamp into Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10, Swamp where Swamp God Swamp spit Swamp the Swamp absolute Swamp fire, Swamp dash fear Swamp not, Swamp for Swamp I Swamp M Swamp with Swamp you, Swamp be Swamp not Swamp dismayed, Swamp for Swamp I Swamp M Swamp your Swamp God. Swamp why all Swamp here Swamp that? Swamp God Swamp rolling Swamp up Swamp like, Swamp dash Swamp chill, Swamp posse, Swamp I Swamp God Swamp your Swamp back, Swamp no Swamp fear Swamp gonna Swamp gator chomp Swamp my Swamp crew, Swamp today, Swamp where Swamp unpacking Swamp how Swamp faith Swamp eats Swamp fear Swamp like Swamp a Swamp flaming Swamp glitter Swamp nuke Swamp exploding Swamp and Swamp the Swamp. Swamp will Swamp break Swamp down Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10 Swamp like Swamp a Swamp Bible Swamp ninja Swamp slicing Swamp through Swamp chaos, Swamp tell Swamp a Swamp story Swamp about Swamp someone Swamp slaying Swamp fear Swamp like Swamp a Swamp gen Swamp z Swamp meme Swamp lord, Swamp drop Swamp some Swamp practical Swamp faith Swamp hack Swamp to Swamp keep Swamp your Swamp vibe Swamp on Swamp fleek, Swamp and Swamp hype Swamp you Swamp up Swamp with Swamp the Swamp dash hashtag eat your fear. Swamp challenge. Swamp yeah, Swamp you Swamp herd Swamp me Swamp right Swamp grab Swamp a Swamp pen, Swamp right Swamp down Swamp 1 Swamp fear Swamp that's Swamp and Swamp messing Swamp with Swamp you, Swamp pray Swamp at Swamp bot Swamp with Swamp Jesus, Swamp and Swamp holler Swamp your Swamp story Swamp and Swamp the Swamp comments. Swamp this Swamp ain't Swamp just Swamp talk, Swamp posse, Swamp at Swamp faith Swamp that Swamp moves Swamp mountains Swamp and Swamp eats Swamp gators Swamp out of Swamp your Swamp life. Swamp so, Swamp get Swamp ready Swamp for Swamp 100 Swamp minutes Swamp of Swamp swagger Swamp faith Swamp that Swamp gonna Swamp light Swamp your Swamp soul Swamp on Swamp fire. Swamp grab Swamp your Swamp Bible, Swamp smash Swamp that Swamp like Swamp button, Swamp and Swamp let Swamp dive Swamp in. Swamp who's Swamp with Swamp me? Swamp holler Swamp dash Swamp Jesus, Swamp and Swamp the Swamp comments, Swamp and Swamp let Swamp roll Swamp the Swamp thing. Swamp dash hashtag higher calling Swamp dash hashtag eat your fear. Energetic pause, transition to main content, Zhang Azure NUS Sky Neural, Talk Do plus 20%, Fong Catch Energetic, Swamp alright, Swamp posse, Swamp where Swamp diving Swamp right Swamp into Swamp the Swamp word Swamp like Swamp a Swamp Bible Swamp ninja Swamp slicing Swamp through Swamp a Swamp junkyard Swamp on Swamp a Swamp moonshine Swamp rampage. Swamp where Swamp unpacking Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10, Swamp and Swamp oil, Swamp the Swamp vs Swamp a Swamp straight Swamp fire, Swamp a Swamp divine Swamp Molotov Swamp chill bum Swamp exploding Swamp fear Swamp right Swamp out Swamp of Swamp your Swamp life. Swamp listen Swamp up, Swamp hears Swamp what Swamp God Swamp says, Swamp dash fear Swamp not, Swamp for Swamp I Swamp M Swamp with Swamp you, Swamp be Swamp not Swamp dismayed, Swamp for Swamp I Swamp M Swamp your Swamp God, Swamp I Swamp will Swamp strengthen Swamp you, Swamp I Swamp will Swamp help Swamp you, Swamp I Swamp will Swamp uphold Swamp you Swamp with Swamp my Swamp righteous Swamp right Swamp hand. Swamp woe, Swamp why all Swamp feel Swamp that? Swamp that Swamp God Swamp dropping Swamp a Swamp faith Swamp nuke Swamp so Swamp hot Swamp at Swamp makes Swamp fear Swamp run Swamp like Swamp a Swamp gator Swamp on Swamp a Swamp meth Swamp rampage. Swamp so, Swamp let Swamp break Swamp the Swamp down Swamp like Swamp where Swamp chomping Swamp through Swamp a Swamp full Swamp of Swamp truth. Swamp first Swamp up, Swamp dash fear Swamp not. Swamp oil, Swamp God Swamp ain't Swamp just Swamp whispering Swamp the Swamp like Swamp some Swamp chill Swamp vibe, Swamp he's Swamp commanding Swamp at Swamp like Swamp a Swamp general Swamp leading Swamp a Swamp faith Swamp army. Swamp why Swampkin Swamp he Swamp say Swamp this? Swamp cause swampy swamp god, swamp the swamp king swamp of swamp kings, swamp the swamp goat swamp of swamp all swamp geo it is, swamp and swampies swamp god swamp your swamp back swamp 24/7, swamp 365, swamp no swamp breaks, swamp no swamp vacations. Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10 Swamp was swamp written swamp to swamp Israel swamp when swamp they swamp were swamp shaking swamp and swamp their swamp symbols, swamp facing swamp enemies, swamp exile, swamp and swamp all swamp kinds swamp of swamp chaos. Swamp they swamp were swamp staring swamp down swamp fear swamp like swamp at swamp was swamp a swamp 10-foot swamp gator swamp with swamp laser swamp eyes swamp but swamp god swamp roll swamp up swamp and swamp says swamp dash swamp nah swamp you swamp don't swamp need swamp to swamp sweat swamp this swamp am swamp right swamp here swamp now swamp let's swamp make swamp this swamp real swamp for swamp you swamp posse swamp cause swamp fear swamp ain't swamp just swamp some swamp ancient swamp is real swamp drama. Swamp fear swamp is swamp that swamp pit swamp in swamp your swamp stomach swamp when swamp your swamp boss swamp text swamp you swamp at swamp 5 swamp am swamp with swamp dash we swamp need swamp to swamp talk swamp asib. Swamp pit swamp that swamp sweat swamp dripping swamp down swamp your swamp forehead swamp when swamp your swamp bank swamp account swamp screams swamp dash swamp zero swamp dollars swamp good swamp luck swamp buddy. Swamp or swamp maybe swamp at swamp that swamp late night swamp scroll swamp on swamp social swamp media swamp where swamp your swamp comparing swamp your swamp life swamp to swamp some swamp influencers swamp perfectly swamp filtered swamp highlight swamp real swamp and swamp your swamp thinking swamp dash swamp am swamp never swamp gonna swamp make swamp it. Swamp fear swamp hit swamp like swamp a swamp flaming swamp litter swamp nuke swamp exploding swamp and swamp your swamp guts swamp but swamp here's swamp the swamp kicker swamp god swamp like swamp dash swamp chill swamp am swamp right swamp here swamp and swamp I swamp ain't swamp leaving swamp you swamp to swamp fight swamp the swamp alone swamp let's swamp zoom swamp and swamp on swamp the swamp next swamp piece swamp dash for swamp I swamp am swamp with swamp you. Swamp while, swamp this swamp ain't swamp some swamp distance swamp god swamp sitting swamp on swamp a swamp cloud swamp playing swamp a swamp harp swamp and swamp sipping swamp celestial swamp coffee. Swamp this swamp is swamp god swamp rolling swamp up swamp like swamp your swamp day one swamp homie swamp your swamp ride or die swamp saying swamp dash swamp a swamp god swamp you swamp no swamp matter swamp what swamp chaos swamp comes swamp your swamp way. Swamp back swamp and swamp Isaiah is swamp day swamp Israel swamp was swamp facing swamp empires swamp like swamp Babylon swamp who swamp were swamp throwing swamp shade swamp and swamp threatening swamp to swamp wipe swamp them swamp out. Swamp but swamp god swamp says swamp dash swamp am swamp with swamp you swamp and swamp that swamp a swamp promise swamp stronger swamp than swamp any swamp army swamp any swamp gator swamp any swamp fear swamp your swamp facing swamp today. Swamp god swamp presence swamp is swamp like swamp a swamp neon swamp shield swamp glowing swamp and swamp the swamp dark swamp protecting swamp you swamp from swamp every swamp hit swamp and swamp check swamp the swamp out swamp dash be swamp not swamp dismayed swamp for swamp I swamp am swamp your swamp god. Swamp dismayed swamp is swamp that swamp feeling swamp when swamp your swamp like swamp dash swamp I swamp can't swamp do swamp this swamp am swamp done swamp my swamp life swamp a swamp dumpster swamp fire. Swamp maybe swamp here swamp facing swamp a swamp doctor swamp report swamp that swamp got swamp you swamp shook swamp or swamp a swamp family swamp drama swamp that swamp hitting swamp harder swamp than swamp a swamp soap swamp opera swamp on swamp steroids. Swamp god swamp says swamp dash swamp don't swamp let swamp that swamp fear swamp paralyze swamp you. Swamp am swamp not swamp just swamp some swamp random swamp deities swamp am swamp your swamp god swamp the swamp one swamp who swamp made swamp you swamp love swamp you swamp and swamp show swamp you. Swamp this swamp is swamp god swamp flexing swamp is swamp personal swamp connection swamp to swamp you swamp posse swamp reminding swamp you swamp that swamp he's swamp god swamp a swamp custom swamp faith swamp plan swamp for swamp your swamp life swamp now swamp let swamp hit swamp the swamp next swamp part swamp dash I swamp will swamp strengthen swamp you swamp I swamp will swamp help swamp you swamp I swamp will swamp uphold swamp you swamp with swamp my swamp righteous swamp right swamp hand. Swamp while, swamp the swamp is swamp god swamp handing swamp you swamp the swamp ultimate swamp faith swamp toolkit. Swamp strength swamp to swamp stand swamp tall swamp when swamp life swamp try swamp to swamp knock swamp you swamp down. Swamp help swamp to swamp carry swamp the swamp load swamp when swamp at swamp feels swamp like swamp a swamp done swamp of swamp mud. Swamp and swamp upholding swamp you swamp when swamp your swamp about swamp to swamp crash swamp like swamp a swamp rusty swamp truck swamp on swamp a swamp back road. Swamp imagine swamp here swamp stuck swamp in swamp a swamp swamp, swamp mud swamp up swamp to swamp your swamp knees, swamp gators swamp circling swamp like swamp they swamp smell swamp a swamp snack, swamp and swamp god swamp rolls swamp up swamp like swamp a swamp superhero, swamp lifting swamp you swamp out swamp with swamp his swamp righteous swamp right swamp hand. Swamp that swamp the swamp kind swamp of swamp god swamp we swamp serve, swamp posse, swamp a swamp god swamp who swamp does and swamp just swamp watch swamp from swamp the swamp sidelines, swamp but swamp jumps swamp and swamp to swamp fight swamp your swamp battles, swamp let's swamp talk swamp about swamp how swamp this swamp lens swamp in swamp 2025, swamp cause swamp fear swamp is swamp everywhere swamp today, swamp while. Swamp where swamp living swamp in swamp a swamp world swamp where swamp news swamp headlines swamp scream swamp doom swamp like swamp a swamp 24/7 swamp horror swamp movie. Swamp social swamp media swamp pushing swamp FOMO swamp so swamp hard swamp you swamp feel swamp like swamp your swamp failing swamp just swamp by swamp existing. Swamp and swamp life swamp keeps swamp throwing swamp curveball swamp like swamp a swamp pitcher swamp on swamp red swamp bull, swamp weather swamp it's swamp job swamp stress, swamp relationship swamp drama, swamp or swamp just swamp the swamp vibe swamp of swamp not swamp knowing swamp what's swamp around swamp the swamp corner. Swamp but swamp Isaiah swamp 41:10 swamp is swamp timeless, swamp posse. Swamp it swamp god swamp saying, swamp dash swamp I swamp see swamp your swamp struggle, swamp I swamp no swamp your swamp fear, swamp and swamp I am swamp here swamp to swamp eat swamp it swamp for swamp you. Swamp this swamp verse swamp ain't swamp just swamp a swamp pretty swamp quote swamp to swamp post swamp on swamp your swamp story, swamp it swamp a swamp battle swamp plan swamp to swamp slay swamp fear swamp with swamp faith swamp that swamp slaps swamp harder swamp than swamp a swamp gator swamp tail, swamp let's swamp dig swamp a swamp little swamp deeper, swamp cause swamp this swamp verse swamp has swamp layers swamp like swamp a swamp onion swamp that's swamp making swamp fear swamp cry. Swamp when swamp god swamp says, swamp dash fear swamp not, swamp he's swamp not swamp asking swamp you swamp to swamp ignore swamp your swamp fears. Swamp fear swamp is swamp real swamp it swamp that swamp racing swamp heartbeat, swamp that swamp not swamp and swamp your swamp throat, swamp that swamp voice swamp and swamp your swamp head swamp saying, swamp dash swamp you swamp ain't swamp good swamp enough. Swamp god swamp knows swamp that, swamp and swamp he's swamp not swamp shaming swamp you swamp for swamp feeling swamp it. Swamp instead, swamp he's swamp saying, swamp dash swamp bring swamp that swamp fear swamp to swamp me, swamp and swamp pile swamp eat swamp it swamp with swamp my swamp power. Swamp Isaiah swamp 41:10 swamp is swamp like swamp god swamp handing swamp you swamp a swamp neon swamp sword swamp of swamp faith, swamp saying, swamp dash swamp go swamp slay swamp that swamp gator, swamp am swamp right swamp behind swamp you, swamp and swamp here's swamp where swamp it swamp gets swamp wild, swamp god swamp promise swamp and swamp the swamp verse swamp is in swamp just swamp about swamp making swamp you swamp feel swamp good to swamp it swamp about swamp transforming swamp how swamp you swamp face swamp life. Swamp when swampy swamp says, swamp dash I swamp will swamp strengthen swamp you, swampy swamp giving swamp you swamp the swamp guts swamp to swamp keep swamp going swamp when swamp you swamp wanna swamp quit. Swamp when swampy swamp says, swamp dash I swamp will swamp help swamp you, swampy swamp sending swamp you swamp the swamp right swamp people, swamp the swamp right swamp opportunities, swamp the swamp right swamp vibes swamp at swamp the swamp right swamp time. Swamp and swamp when swampy swamp says, swamp dash I swamp will swamp uphold swamp you, swampy swamp promising swamp to swamp hold swamp you swamp up swamp when swamp your swamp falling, swamp like swamp a swamp divine swamp safety swamp net swamp catching swamp you swamp before swamp you swamp hit swamp the swamp floor. Swamp now, swamp let's swamp bring swamp the swamp home swamp for swamp a swamp second, swamp cause swamp the swamp verse swamp is swamp personal, swamp posse. Swamp god swamp not swamp talking swamp to swamp some swamp abstract swamp crowd, swamp he swamp talking swamp to swamp you. Swamp that swamp fear swamp of swamp failing swamp your swamp finals? Swamp god swamp saying, swamp dash swamp am swamp with swamp you, swamp will swamp study swamp this swamp out. Swamp that swamp fear swamp of swamp being swamp alone swamp after swamp a swamp breakup? Swamp god swamp saying, swamp dash swamp am swamp your swamp ride or die, swamp I swamp ain't swamp going swamp nowhere. Swamp that swamp fear swamp of swamp not swamp knowing swamp what's swamp next swamp and swamp your swamp career? Swamp god swamp saying, swamp dash swamp I swamp got swamp a swamp plan, swamp trust swamp me swamp to swamp eat swamp the swamp uncertainty. Swamp Isaiah swamp 41:10 swamp is swamp god swamp promise swamp to swamp be swamp your swamp light swamp and swamp the swamp dark, swamp your swamp shield, swamp and swamp the swamp storm, swamp your swamp coat, swamp and swamp the swamp chaos, swamp so, swamp before swamp we swamp move swamp to swamp the swamp next swamp part, swamp I swamp wanna swamp here swamp from swamp you, swamp posse. Swamp holler swamp and swamp the swamp comments, swamp watch swamp one swamp fear swamp your swamp facing swamp right swamp now? Swamp is swamp at swamp a swamp job swamp thing, swamp a swamp relationship swamp drama, swamp or swamp just swamp the swamp vibe swamp of swamp not swamp knowing swamp what's swamp around swamp the swamp corner? Swamp drop swamp at swamp below swamp and swamp let's swamp pray swamp at swamp out swamp together. Swamp or swamp building swamp a swamp swamp posse swamp that's swamp all swamp about swamp eating swamp fear swamp with swamp Jesus, swamp so swamp keep swamp the swamp faith swamp vibe swamp rolling. Swamp dash hashtag eat your fear. Swamp let's swamp get swamp ready swamp to swamp dive swamp into swamp a swamp swamp story swamp that swamp gonna swamp show swamp you swamp how swamp this swamp verse swamp play swamp out swamp in swamp real swamp life. Pause, transition to Q fan 2. Swamp yo, swamp posse, swamp weavy swamp just swamp unpack swamp Isaiah swamp 41:10 swamp like swamp a swamp Bible swamp ninja swamp slicing swamp through swamp a swamp junkyard swamp of swamp truth, swamp and swamp now swamp at swamp time swamp to swamp get swamp real swamp with swamp a swamp story swamp that swamp gonna swamp hit swamp you swamp right swamp and swamp the swamp feels. Swamp meet swamp swamp Jake, swamp a swamp 23-year-old swamp Jen swamp Z swamp dude swamp from swamp Chicago, swamp who's swamp about swamp to swamp show swamp a swamp how swamp faith swamp eats swamp fear swamp like swamp a swamp flaming swamp Molotov swamp chill bomb swamp on swamp a swamp moonshine swamp rampage. Swamp Jake swamp not swamp some swamp cape swamp superhero swampy swamp just swamp a swamp regular swamp guy swamp with swamp a swamp phone swamp full swamp of swamp unread swamp texts, swamp a swamp dream swamp bigger swamp than swamp is swamp bank swamp account, swamp and swamp a swamp hard swamp ready swamp to swamp slay swamp some swamp gators. Swamp so, swamp picture swamp the swamp vibe, swamp Jake swamp working swamp a swamp dead end swamp job swamp at swamp a swamp coffee swamp shop swamp and swamp downtown swamp Chicago, swamp slinging swamp latte swamp for swamp Karen swamp who swamp complain swamp about swamp do swamp much swamp foam swamp or swamp not swamp enough swamp syrup. Swamp is swamp bill swamp or swamp piling swamp up swamp like swamp a swamp junkyard swamp of swamp rusty swamp cars, swamp and swamp his swamp girlfriend swamp just swamp dump swamp him swamp via swamp text swamp yeah swamp a swamp low battery swamp emoji swamp and swamp a swamp cold swamp dash we're swamp done. Swamp to swamp top swamp at swamp off, swamp Jake swamp boss swamp call swamp him swamp and swamp one swamp day swamp and swamp says, swamp dash swamp Jake, swamp we're swamp cutting swamp hours, swamp your swamp down swamp to swamp 15 swamp a swamp week. Swamp Jake swamp life swamp with swamp feeling swamp like swamp a swamp swamp on swamp fire, swamp with swamp gators swamp circling swamp and swamp no swamp escape swamp in swamp site. Swamp fear swamp hit swamp him swamp like swamp a swamp glitter swamp volcano swamp exploding swamp on swamp his swamp laptop swamp fear swamp of swamp failure, swamp fear swamp of swamp being swamp alone, swamp fear swamp of swamp never swamp making swamp at swamp out swamp of swamp the swamp mess. Swamp 1 swamp night, swamp Jake swamp crashing swamp and swamp his swamp tiny swamp apartment, swamp scrolling swamp through swamp social swamp at swamp 2 swamp am, swamp doom swamping swamp news swamp headlines swamp and swamp feeling swamp like swamp his swamp dreams swamp or swamp sinking swamp and swamp quicksand. Swampy swamp thinking, swamp dash swamp am swamp 23, swamp and swamp my swamp life swamp already swamp a swamp dumpster swamp fire. Swamp I swamp wanted swamp to swamp be swamp a swamp graphic swamp designer, swamp but swamp am swamp stuck swamp making swamp cappuccino swamp for swamp yelling swamp customers. Swamp Watts swamp the swamp point? Swamp fear swamp was swamp chomping swamp him swamp like swamp a swamp gator swamp on swamp a swamp myth swamp rampage, swamp whispering, swamp dash swamp you'll swamp never swamp be swamp good swamp enough, swamp Jake. Swamp your swamp gonna swamp be swamp stuck swamp here swamp forever. Swamp but swamp then, swamp something swamp wild swamp happens, swamp Jake swamp mom swamp text swamp him swamp a swamp Bible swamp verse. Swamp yeah, swamp mom swamp be swamp dropping swamp truth swamp bombs swamp like swamp that, swamp even swamp at swamp 2 swamp am, swamp the swamp text swamp says, swamp dash swamp Jake, swamp read swamp Isaiah swamp 41:10, swamp fear swamp not, swamp for swamp I swamp am swamp with swamp you, swamp be swamp not swamp dismayed, swamp for swamp I swamp am swamp your swamp god. Swamp Jake swamp for swamp thought swamp is, swamp dash swamp mom, swamp I swamp ain't swamp got swamp time swamp for swamp this, swamp am swamp busy swamp doom scrolling swamp my swamp life swamp away. Swamp but swamp he swamp read swamp at swamp anyway, swamp and swamp something swamp clicks swamp like swamp a swamp neon swamp light swamp flickering swamp on swamp and swamp his swamp heart. Swampy swamp read swamp at swamp again, swamp dash fear swamp not, swamp for swamp I swamp am swamp with swamp you, swamp I swamp will swamp strengthen swamp you, swamp I swamp will swamp help swamp you, swamp I swamp will swamp uphold swamp you, swamp with swamp my swamp righteous swamp right swamp hand. Swamp Jake swamp like, swamp dash swamp okay, swamp god, swamp your swamp saying swamp your swamp with swamp me? Swamp like, swamp for swamp real swamp real? Swamp cause swamp I am swamp feeling swamp like swamp a swamp total swamp fail swamp right swamp now. Swamp so, swamp Jake swamp does swamp something swamp he swamp hasn't swamp done swamp and swamp forever, swamp he swamp grabs swamp his swamp Bible swamp from swamp under swamp a swamp pile swamp of swamp laundry. Swamp don't swamp judge, swamp posse, swamp weavy swamp all swamp and swamp there, swamp with swamp a swamp Bible swamp buried swamp under swamp sweatshirts swamp and swamp sock swamp avalanche. Swampy swamp flips swamp to swamp Isaiah swamp 41:10 swamp and swamp reads swamp at swamp out swamp loud, swamp like swamp he's swamp trying swamp to swamp convinced swamp himself, swamp dash fear swamp not, swamp for swamp I swamp am swamp with swamp you. Swamp and swamp then, swamp Jake swamp gets swamp on swamp his swamp knees, swamp first swamp time swamps and swamp he swamp was swamp a swamp kid swamp and swamp Sunday swamp school swamp and swamp praise, swamp dash swamp Jesus, swamp I am swamp scared swamp I am swamp gonna swamp fail. Swamp I am swamp scared swamp I am swamp gonna swamp be swamp alone swamp forever. Swamp my swamp life swamp a swamp miss, swamp but swamp you swamp said swamp your swamp with swamp me, swamp so swamp I am swamp giving swamp the swamp fear swamp to swamp you. Swamp help swamp me swamp eat swamp the swamp gator swamp out swamp of swamp my swamp heart, swamp and swamp while, swamp something swamp shift swamp and swamp that swamp moment. Swamp pit swamp not swamp like swamp the swamp sky swamp open swamp and swamp angels swamp start swamp singing swamp a swamp hip hop swamp hallelujah swamp bo swamp that it swamp be swamplet swamp but swamp Jake swamp feels swamp a swamp piece swamp he swamp hasn't swamp felt swamp and swamp ages. Swamp pit swamp like swamp god swamp drop swamp a swamp chill swamp ray swamp right swamp into swamp is swamp soul swamp saying swamp dash swamp Jake swamp I swamp god swamp you swamp dude swamp no swamp gators swamp gonna swamp take swamp you swamp down. Swamp Jake swamp starts swamp seeing swamp is swamp fear swamp not swamp is swamp a swamp gator swamp he's swamp got a swamp wrestle swamp alone swamp but swamp is swamp something swamp he swamp can swamp eat swamp with swamp god swamp backup. Swamp pit swamp like swamp Isaiah swamp 41:10 swamp became swamp a swamp neon swamp sword swamp and swamp is swamp hand, swamp ready swamp to swamp slash swamp through swamp the swamp chaos, swamp so, swamp Jake swamp decide swamp to swamp take swamp a swamp step. Swampy swamp wakes swamp up swamp the swamp next swamp day swamp and swamp starts swamp working swamp on swamp his swamp graphic swamp design swamp portfolio swamp something swamp he'd swamp put swamp off swamp for swamp month swamp cause swamp he swamp was swamp scared swamp at swamp wouldn't swamp be swamp good swamp enough. Swamp he swamp spends swamp hours swamp tweaking swamp designs, swamp praying swamp under swamp his swamp breath, swamp dash swamp god, swamp give swamp me swamp the swamp strength swamp to swamp keep swamp going. Swampy swamp even swamp reaches swamp out swamp to swamp a swamp old swamp friend swamp from swamp art swamp class, swamp who swamp tells swamp him swamp about swamp a swamp local swamp church swamp with swamp a swamp young swamp adult swamp group. Swamp Jake swamp like, swamp dash swamp church? Swamp me? Swamp I swamp ain't swamp and swamps and swamp I swamp was swamp force swamp to swamp go swamp as swamp a swamp kid, swamp but swampy swamp feels swamp a swamp nudge, swamp like swamp god swamp sing, swamp dash swamp go swamp on, swamp Jake, swamp I swamp god swamp something swamp for swamp you, swamp Jake swamp shows swamp up swamp to swamp the swamp church swamp group, swamp feeling swamp like swamp a swamp fish swamp out swamp of swamp water, swamp but swamp the swamp people swamp their swamp are swamp chill, swamp not swamp the swamp judgy swamp vibe swamp he swamp expected. Swamp he swamp shares swamp a swamp little swamp about swamp his swamp struggles, swamp and swamp one swamp dude swamp name swamp Mike swamp says, swamp dash swamp yo, swamp Jake, swamp Ivy swamp and swamp there. Swamp Isaiah swamp 41:10 swamp got swamp me swamp through swamp a swamp rough swamp patch swamp 2. Swamp they swamp pray swamp together, swamp and swamp Jake swamp feels swamp like swamp he's swamp not swamp alone swamp for swamp the swamp first swamp time swamp and swamp forever. Swamp pit swamp like swamp god swamps and swamp a swamp hole swamp swamp posse swamp to swamp back swamp him swamp up, swamp over swamp the swamp next swamp few swamp weeks, swamp Jake swamp keeps swamp pushing. Swampy swamps and swamp his swamp portfolio swamp to swamp a swamp few swamp freelance swamp gigs, swamp praying swamp Isaiah swamp 41:10 swamp over swamp each swamp email, swamp dash swamp god, swamp uphold swamp me, swamp don't swamp let swamp me swamp crash. Swamp 1 Swamp Date, Swampy Swamp Gets Swamp A Swamp Reply Swamp A Swamp Small Swamp Design Swamp Agency Swamp Wants Swamp to Swamp Hire Swamp Him Swamp for Swamp A Swamp Project Swamp Pit Swamp Not Swamp A Swamp $1 million Swamp Deal Swamp But Swamp Pit Swamp A Swamp Start Swamp and Swamp Jake Swamp Feels Swamp Like Swamp He's Swamp Finally Swamp Moving Swamp Forward Swampy Swamp Starts Swamp Going Swamp to Swamp The Swamp Church Swamp Group Swamp Regularly Swamp Making Swamp Friends Swamp Who Swamp Lift Swamp Him Swamp Up Swamp and Swamp He Swamp Even Swamp Design Swamp A Swamp Flyer Swamp for Swamp Their Swamp Next Swamp Event Swamp for Swamp Free Swamp Cause Swamp He's Swamp Just Swamp That Swamp Hype Swamp to Swamp Give Swamp Back Swamp Now Swamp Don't Swamp Get Swamp At Swamp Twisted Swamp Posse Swamp Jake Swamp Life Swamp Didn't Swamp Turn Swamp into Swamp A Swamp Fairy Swamp Tail Swamp Overnight Swampy Swamp Still Swamp Had Swamp Bills Swamp Still Swamp Had Swamp Rough Swamp Days Swamp Still Swamp Felt Swamp Fear Swamp Trying Swamp to Swamp Gator Chomp Swamp Him Swamp Now Swamp and Swamp Then Swamp But Swamp Here's Swamp The Swamp Kicker Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10 Swamp Changed Swamp How Swamp He Swamp Faced Swamp Those Swamp Gators Swamp Instead Swamp of Swamp Letting Swamp Fear Swamp Paralyze Swamp Him Swamp Jake Swamp Started Swamp Seeing Swamp At Swamp As Swamp Something Swamp He Swamp Could Swamp Eat Swamp With Swamp God Swamp Help Swamp Every Swamp Time Swamp He Swamp Felt Swamp That Swamp Pit Swamp and Swamp His Swamp Stomach Swamp Eat Swamp Pull Swamp Out Swamp His Swamp Bible Swamp or Swamp Just Swamp Pray Swamp Dash Swamp Jesus Swamp Here Swamp With Swamp Me Swamp Let Swamp Sling Swamp The Swamp Fear Swamp Together Swamp and Swamp Bit Swamp by Swamp Bit Swamp Step Swamp by Swamp Step Swamp Jake Swamp When Swamp From Swamp Drowning Swamp and Swamp Fear Swamp to Swamp Slaying Swamp at Swamp Like Swamp A Swamp Faith Swamp Warrior Swamp So Swamp What Swamp The Swamp Big Swamp Takeaway Swamp From Swamp Swamp Jake's Swamp Story Swamp It's Swamp Not Swamp About Swamp Having Swamp All Swamp The Swamp Answers Swamp or Swamp A Swamp Perfect Swamp Life Swamp Pit Swamp About Swamp Trusting Swamp God Swamp Promise Swamp and Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10 Swamp He's Swamp With Swamp You Swamp Heal Swamp Strengthen Swamp You Swamp Heal Swamp Help Swamp You Swamp Heal Swamp Uphold Swamp You Swamp Jake Swamp Didn't Swamp Eat Swamp Fear Swamp by Swamp Being Swamp A Swamp Superhero Swamp He Swamp Did Swamp At Swamp by Swamp Letting Swamp God Swamp Be Swamp His Swamp Backup Swamp and Swamp While Swamp That Swamp A Swamp Vibe Swamp Any Swamp of Swamp A Swamp Can Swamp Tap Swamp Into Swamp Weather Swamp Here Swamp Facing Swamp A Swamp Breakup Swamp A Swamp Job Swamp Fail Swamp or Swamp Just Swamp The Swamp Wait Swamp of Swamp 2025 Swamp Chaos Swamp God Swamp Sing Swamp Dash Swamp A Swamp God Swamp You Swamp Let Swamp Eat Swamp The Swamp Fear Swamp Together Swamp Before Swamp We Swamp Roll Swamp to Swamp The Swamp Next Swamp Part Swamp I Swamp Wanna Swamp Here Swamp From Swamp You Swamp Posse Swamp What Swamp Your Swamp Swamp Jake Swamp Story Swamp What Swamp A Swamp Fear Swamp Here Swamp Facing Swamp That Swamp Got Swamp You Swamp Feeling Swamp Like Swamp Here Swamp Stuck Swamp and Swamp A Swamp 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 Holler Swamp At Swamp and Swamp The Swamp Comments Swamp and Swamp Let Swamp Pray Swamp At Swamp Out Swamp Together Swamp Maybe Swamp At Swamp Fear Swamp of Swamp Failing Swamp A Swamp Test Swamp Fear Swamp of Swamp Being Swamp Alone Swamp or Swamp Fear Swamp of Swamp Not Swamp Making Swamp At Swamp and Swamp Your Swamp Dreams Swamp Whatever Swamp At Swamp Is Swamp Drop Swamp At Swamp Below Swamp and Swamp Tag Swamp A Swamp With Swamp Dash Hashtag Eat Your Fear Swamp Where Swamp A Swamp Swamp Posse Swamp That Swamp All Swamp About Swamp Lifting Swamp Each Swamp Other Swamp Up Swamp and Swamp Slaying Swamp Chaos Swamp With Swamp Jesus Swamp Let Swamp Keep Swamp The Swamp Faith Swamp Vibe Swamp Rolling Swamp Into Swamp Some Swamp Practical Swamp Hacks Swamp to Swamp Eat Swamp Fear Swamp in Swamp Your Swamp Own Swamp Life Swamp Dash Hashtag Higher Calling Pause, transition to Tufan 3, Swampio, Swamp Posse, Swamp Weavy Swamp Just Swamplet Swamp Up Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10 Swamp Like Swamp A Swamp Neon Swamp Bible Swamp Ninja Swamp Slicing Swamp Through Swamp Fear, Swamp and Swamp We Swamp Watch Swamp Swamp Jake Swamp Eat Swamp His Swamp Gators Swamp Like Swamp A Swamp Gen Swampsy Swamp Meme Swamp Lord Swamp on Swamp A Swamp Moonshine Swamp Rampage Swamp Now, Swamp It Swamp Your Swamp Turn Swamp to Swamp Grab Swamp That Swamp Faith Swamp and Swamp Sling Swamp Fear Swamp Right Swamp Out Swamp of Swamp Your Swamp Life Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10 Swamp Ain't Swamp Just Swamp A Swamp Verse Swamp to Swamp Memorize Swamp or Swamp A Swamp Story Swamp to Swamp Vibe Swamp with Swamp It Swamp A Swamp Battle Swamp Plan Swamp to Swamp Live Swamp Bold Swamp Love Swamp Strong Swamp and Swamp Eat Swamp Fear Swamp Like Swamp A Swamp Flaming Swamp Molotov Swamp Chill Bum Swamp So, Swamp Grab Swamp Your Swamp Bible, Swamp A Swamp Pen, Swamp and Swamp Let Swamp Get Swamp Practical Swamp with Swamp Some Swamp Faith Swamp Hacks Swamp to Swamp Make Swamp The Swamp Faith Swamp Vibe Swamp Pop Swamp Off Swamp and Swamp Your Swamp 2025 Swamp Life Swamp Hack Swamp Number Swamp 1, Swamp Right Swamp That Swamp Fear Swamp Down Swamp at, swamp by swamp no swamp at swamp sounds swamp like swamp homework, swamp and swamp your swamp probably swamp thinking, swamp dash swamp dude, swamp by swamp ain't swamp in swamp school, swamp why swamp am swamp by swamp writing swamp stuff? Swamp but swamp stay swamp with swamp me, swamp posse, swamp cause swamp the swamp is swamp key. Swamp fear swamp love swamp to swamp lurk swamp and swamp the swamp shadows swamp of swamp your swamp mind, swamp like swamp a swamp gator swamp hiding swamp and swamp the swamp mud, swamp whispering swamp lies swamp like, swamp dash swamp you swamp ain't swamp good swamp enough. Swamp when swamp you swamp right swamp that swamp fear swamp down, swamp your swamp dragging swamp that swamp gator swamp into swamp the swamp light swamp where swamp at swamp can't swamp hide. Swamp so, swamp grab swamp a swamp piece swamp of swamp paper, swamp a swamp sticky swamp note, swamp or swamp even swamp your swamp phone swamp notes swamp up, swamp whatever swamp works swamp for swamp you swamp and swamp right swamp one swamp fear swamp that swamp bin swamp gator chomping swamp your swamp vibes. Swamp maybe swamp pit swamp fear swamp of swamp failing swamp your swamp finals, swamp fear swamp of swamp speaking swamp and swamp public, swamp or swamp fear swamp of swamp never swamp finding swamp your swamp purpose. Swamp don't swamp overthink swamp it, swamp just swamp name swamp it swamp and swamp get swamp it swamp out swamp of swamp your swamp head. Swamp hack swamp number swamp 2, swamp read swamp Isaiah swamp 41:10 swamp out swamp loud swamp and swamp pray swamp it swamp over swamp that swamp fear. Swamp open swamp your swamp Bibles swamp or swamp pull swamp at swamp up swamp on swamp your swamp phone swamp if swamp your swamp fancy swamp and swamp read swamp the swamp fire swamp dash fear swamp nut swamp for swamp by swamp am swamp with swamp you swamp be swamp not swamp dismayed swamp for swamp by swamp am swamp your swamp god swamp by swamp will swamp strengthen swamp you swamp by swamp will swamp help swamp you swamp by swamp will swamp uphold swamp you swamp with swamp my swamp righteous swamp right swamp hand. Swamp while, swamp let swamp those swamp words swamp sink swamp and swamp like swamp a swamp chill swamp ray swamp on swamp a swamp hot swamp Chicago swamp day. Swamp read swamp at swamp out swamp loud, swamp like swamp your swamp trying swamp to swamp wake swamp up swamp the swamp hole swamp posse. Swamp then, swamp pray swamp something swamp real, swamp like, swamp dash swamp Jesus, swamp am swamp scared swamp of swamp dash, insert swamp fear. Swamp pit swamp got swamp me swamp feeling swamp like swamp a swamp gators swamp chomping swamp my swamp vibes. Swamp but swamp you swamp said swamp your swamp with swamp me, swamp so swamp am swamp giving swamp the swamp fear swamp to swamp you. Swamp strengthen swamp me, swamp help swamp me, swamp uphold swamp me swamp like swamp you swamp promised. Swamp prayer swamp ain't swamp got a swamp be swamp Shakespeare, swamp posse swamp god swamp not swamp grading swamp your swamp grammar. Swamp he's swamp listening swamp to swamp your swamp heart. Swamp hack swamp number swamp 3, swamp take swamp 1 swamp small swamp step swamp to swamp face swamp that swamp fear. Swamp faith swamp ain't swamp just swamp about swamp feeling swamp good swamp or swamp having swamp all swamp the swamp answers swamp pit swamp about swamp doing swamp the swamp thing swamp even swamp when swamp your swamp shaking swamp and swamp your swamp sneakers. Swamp so, swamp if swamp your swamp scared swamp of swamp applying swamp for swamp a swamp job, swamps in swamp 1 swamp resume swamp today, swamp just swamp 1, swamp don't swamp overthink swamp it. Swamp if swamp your swamp scared swamp of swamp talking swamp to swamp someone swamp about swamp a swamp drama, swamp text swamp them swamp a swamp dash yo, swamp can swamp we swamp chat, swamp and swamp hit swamp send. Swamp if swamp your swamp scared swamp of swamp failing swamp a swamp test, swamp start swamp studying swamp for swamp 15 swamp minutes swamp a swamp date swamp baby swamp steps, swamp posse. Swamp god swamp not swamp asking swamp you swamp to swamp slay swamp the swamp hole swamp gator swamp and swamp 1 swamp go swamp he's swamp asking swamp you swamp to swamp trust swamp him swamp and swamp move swamp forward swamp 1 swamp step swamp at swamp a swamp time. Swamp Isaiah swamp 41:10 swamp says swamp heal swamp strengthen swamp you, swamp so swamp lean swamp into swamp that swamp promise swamp and swamp take swamp that swamp step. Swamp hack swamp number swamp 4, swamp share swamp your swamp fear swamp with swamp a swamp trusted swamp homie swamp or swamp a swamp faith swamp crew. Swamp fear swamp love swamp to swamp isolate swamp you, swamp like swamp a swamp gator swamp pulling swamp you swamp under swamp the swamp mud swamp to swamp fight swamp alone. Swamp but swamp god swamp design swamp a swamp to swamp roll swamp together, swamp like swamp a swamp posse swamp riding swamp out swamp to swamp slay swamp chaos. Swamp so, swamp find swamp someone swamp you swamp trust swamp a swamp friend, swamp a swamp family swamp member, swamp or swamp a swamp church swamp group, swamp and swamp open swamp up. Swamp say swamp something swamp like, swamp dash yo, swamp am swamp dealing swamp with swamp the swamp fear swamp of swamp dash, insert swamp fear, swamp and swamp I swamp could swamp you swamp some swamp prayer swamp or swamp advice. Swampude, Swampy, Swamp Surprise, Swamp House, Swamp Mini, Swamp People, Swamp Have, Swamp Face, Swamp The Swamp Same, Swamp Gator, Swampin, Swampkin, Swamp Hype, Swamp You, Swamp Up. Swamp Jake, Swamp from Swamp R, Swamp Last, Swamp Section. Swampy, Swamp Found, Swamp His, Swamp Church, Swamp Crew, Swampin, Swamp They, Swamp Help, Swamp Him, Swamp Eat, Swamp Fear, Swamp Like, Swamp A, Swamp Team, Swamp of, Swamp Bible, Swamp Ninjas. Swamp Sharing, Swamp Year, Swamp Fear, Swamp Ain't, Swamp Weakness, Swamp Posse, Swamp Pit, Swamp Faith, Swamp and Swamp Action, Swamp Letting, Swamp God, Swamp Work, Swamp Through, Swamp Your, Swamp People. Swamp Hack, Swamp Number, Swamp 5, Swamp Keep, Swamp A, Swamp Faith, Swamp Log, Swamp to Swamp Track, Swamp Your, Swamp Progress, Swamp and Swamp Give, Swamp Thanks, Swamp to Swamp God. Swamp While, Swamp Eating, Swamp Fear, Swamp Ain't, Swamp A, Swamp One and Done, Swamp Deal, Swamp It, Swamp A, Swamp Journey, Swamp and Swamp You, Swamp God, a Swamp Celebrate, Swamp The Swamp Wins, Swamp Along, Swamp The Swamp Way. Swamp Grab, Swamp A, Swamp Notebook, Swamp Your, Swamp Phone, Swamp or Swamp Even, Swamp A, Swamp Voice, Swamp Memo, Swamp and Swamp Start, Swamp Jotting, Swamp Down, Swamp What, Swamp Happens, Swamp When, Swamp You, Swamp Apply, Swamp These, Swamp Hacks. Swamp Did, Swamp You, Swamp Pray, Swamp Over, Swamp Your, Swamp Fear, Swamp and Swamp Feel, Swamp A, Swamp Little, Swamp Peace. Swamp Right, Swamp It, Swamp Down. Swamp Did, Swamp You, Swamp Take, Swamp A, Swamp Step, Swamp and Swamp Apply, Swamp for Swamp That Swamp Job. Swamp Log, Swamp It. Swamp Did, Swamp You, Swamp Share, Swamp With, Swamp A, Swamp Friend, Swamp and Swamp Get, Swamp Some, Swamp Prayer. Swamp Jot, Swamp That, Swamp Vibe, Swamp Down. Swamp and Swamp Every, Swamp Time, Swamp You, Swamp See, Swamp God, Swamp Moving, Swamp Give, Swamp Him, Swamp A, Swamp Shout Out, Swamp Dash, Swamp Jesus, Swamp Thanks, Swamp for Swamp Helping, Swamp Me, Swamp Eat, Swamp The Swamp Fear, Swamp Today. Swamp Keeping, Swamp A, Swamp Faith, Swamp Log, Swamp Is, Swamp Like, Swamp Building, Swamp A, Swamp Highlight, Swamp Real, Swamp of Swamp God, Swamp Faithfulness, Swamp and Swamp Piddle, Swamp Hype, Swamp You, Swamp Up, Swamp to Swamp Keep, Swamp Going, Swamp Now, Swamp Let's, Swamp Tie, Swamp This, Swamp All, Swamp Together, Swamp With, Swamp A, Swamp Quick, Swamp Example, Swamp to Swamp Show, Swamp You, Swamp How, Swamp These, Swamp Hacks, Swamp Work, Swamp and Swamp Real, Swamp Life. Swamp Meet, Swamp Swamp Sarah, Swamp A, Swamp 20-year-old, Swamp College, Swamp Student, Swamp Who's, Swamp Been, Swamp Dealing, Swamp With, Swamp Fear, Swamp of Swamp Public, Swamp Speaking. Swamp Every, Swamp Time, Swamp She, Swamp Has, Swamp to Swamp Do, Swamp A, Swamp Class, Swamp Presentation, Swamp Her, Swamp Hard, Swamp Races, Swamp Like, Swamp A, Swamp Gator, Swamp On, Swamp Red, Swamp Bull, Swamp and Swamp She, Swamp Freezes, Swamp Up, Swamp Like, Swamp She's, Swamp Stuck, Swamp in, Swamp, Swamp Mud. Swamp Sarah is Swamp Like, Swamp Dash, Swamp I, Swamp Can't, Swamp Do, Swamp This, Swamp Am, Swamp Gonna, Swamp Look, Swamp Like, Swamp A, Swamp Full. Swamp But, Swamp She, Swamp Here, Swamp This, Swamp Video, Swamp Shout Out, Swamp to Swamp You, Swamp Sarah, Swamp and Swamp Decide, Swamp to Swamp Try, Swamp These, Swamp Hacks. Swamp First, Swamp Sarah, Swamp Right, Swamp Down, Swamp Her, Swamp Fear, Swamp Dash, I'm Swamp Scared, Swamp of Swamp Public, Swamp Speaking, Swamp and Swamp Looking, Swamp Stupid. Swamp Just, Swamp Naming, Swamp It, Swamp Makes, Swamp It, Swamp Feel, Swamp Less, Swamp Like, Swamp A, Swamp 10-foot, Swamp Gator. Swamp Then, Swamp She, Swamp Read, Swamp Isaiah, Swamp 41:10, Swamp Out, Swamp Loud, Swamp In, Swamp Her, Swamp Dorm, Swamp Room, Swamp Dash Fear, Swamp Not, Swamp For, Swamp I, Swamp Am, Swamp With, Swamp You. Swamp She, Swamp Praise, Swamp Dash, Swamp Jesus, Swamp Am, Swamp Freaking, Swamp Out, Swamp About, Swamp This, Swamp Presentation. Swamp Be, Swamp With, Swamp Me, Swamp Give, Swamp Me, Swamp The Swamp Strength, Swamp to Swamp Not, Swamp Crash. Swamp Next, Swamp She, Swamp Takes, Swamp A, Swamp Small, Swamp Step, Swamp She, Swamp Practices, Swamp Her, Swamp Presentation, Swamp In, Swamp Front, Swamp of Swamp Her, Swamp Roommate, Swamp Who's, Swamp Super, Swamp Chill, Swamp and Swamp Gives, Swamp Her, Swamp Props. Swamp Sarah, Swamp Then, Swamp Share, Swamp Her, Swamp Fear, Swamp With, Swamp Her, Swamp Campus, Swamp Bible, Swamp Study, Swamp Group, Swamp and Swamp They, Swamp Pray, Swamp Over, Swamp Her, Swamp Reminding, Swamp Her, Swamp That, Swamp God, Swamp Got, Swamp Her, Swamp Back. Swamp Finally, Swamp Sarah, Swamp Keeps, Swamp A, Swamp Faith, Swamp Log, Swamp Writing, Swamp Down, Swamp House, Swamp She, Swamp Felt, Swamp A, Swamp Little, Swamp Braver, Swamp After, Swamp Each, Swamp Step, Swamp and Swamp She, Swamp Thanks, Swamp God, Swamp For, Swamp Helping, Swamp Her, Swamp Not, Swamp Pass, Swamp Out, Swamp During, Swamp Practice, Swamp When, Swamp Presentation, Swamp Day, Swamp Comes, Swamp Sarah is Swamp Still, Swamp Nervous, Swamp But, Swamp She, Swamp Praise, Swamp Isaiah, Swamp 41:10, Swamp 1, Swamp Last, Swamp Time, Swamp In, Swamp Step, Swamp Up. Swamp She, Swamp Nail, Swamp It, Swamp Not, Swamp Perfect, Swamp But, Swamp She, Swamp Gets, Swamp Through, Swamp Without, Swamp Freezing, Swamp and Swamp Her, Swamp Professor, Swamp Gives, Swamp Her, Swamp A, Swamp Solid, Swamp B. Swamp Sarah is Swamp Like, Swamp Dash, Swamp Yo, Swamp I, Swamp Heated, Swamp That, Swamp Fear, Swamp With, Swamp Jesus. Swamp She, Swamp Right, Swamp It, Swamp In, Swamp Her, Swamp Faith, Swamp Log, Swamp And, Swamp Even, Swamp Posts, Swamp A, Swamp YouTube, Swamp Short, Swamp About, Swamp Her, Swamp Win, Swamp Tagging, Swamp Dash, Hashtag Eat Your Fear, Swamp to Swamp Hype, Swamp Up, Swamp The Swamp, Swamp Posse. Swamp Sarah's Swamp Story. Swamp shows swamp a swamp that swamp eating swamp fear swamp is in swamp about swamp being swamp fearless swamp pit swamp about swamp trusting swamp god swamp to swamp walk swamp with swamp you swamp through swamp the swamp chaos swamp so swamp posse swamp what swamp your swamp swamp Sarah swamp moment swamp what swamp a swamp fear swamp your swamp ready swamp to swamp eat swamp with swamp these swamp hacks swamp I swamp one a swamp here swamp about swamp it swamp in swamp the swamp comments swamp maybe swamp your swamp gonna swamp right swamp down swamp a swamp fear swamp of swamp asking swamp someone swamp out swamp or swamp pray swamp over swamp a swamp fear swamp of swamp moving swamp to swamp a swamp new swamp city swamp or swamp take swamp a swamp step swamp to swamp apply swamp for swamp that swamp dream swamp job swamp whatever swamp it swamp is swamp drop swamp it swamp below swamp and swamp tag swamp a swamp with swamp dash hashtag eat your fear swamp or swamp a swamp swamp pussy swamp that swamp all swamp about swamp slaying swamp fear swamp with swamp Jesus swamp and swamp I swamp can't swamp wait swamp to swamp see swamp your swamp wins swamp let's swamp keep swamp the swamp faith swamp vibe swamp rolling swamp into swamp the swamp next swamp part swamp where swamp gonna swamp tie swamp the swamp all swamp to swamp the swamp hottest swamp 2025 swamp trend swamp to swamp make swamp your swamp faith swamp go swamp viral swamp dash hashtag higher calling pause, transition to 2 fan 4. Swamp yo, swamp posse, swamp where swamp and swamp the swamp home swamp stretch swamp now, swamp and swamp at swamp time swamp to swamp take swamp the swamp faith swamp vibe swamp to swamp the swamp next swamp level swamp with swamp some swamp 2025 swamp YouTube swamp swagger. Swamp Weavy Swamp Unpack Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10 Swamp Watch Swamp Jake Swamp Slay Swamp is Swamp Fears Swamp and Swamp Drop Swamp 5 Swamp Killer Swamp Faith Swamp Hack Swamp to Swamp Help Swamp You Swamp Eat Swamp Your Swamp Own Swamp Gators Swamp but Swamp now Swamp where Swamp Tying Swamp the Swamp all Swamp together Swamp with Swamp the Swamp Hottest Swamp Gen Swamp Z Swamp Trend Swamp of Swamp the Swamp Here Swamp Eat Swamp yet, swamp you swamp red swamp me swamp right, swamp where swamp eating swamp fear swamp like swamp a swamp flaming swamp molotov swamp chill bomb swamp and swamp making swamp the swamp fit swamp vibe swamp go swamp viral swamp for swamp Jesus. Swamp so, swamp grab swamp your swamp phone, swamp get swamp ready swamp to swamp sling swamp some swamp content, swamp and swamp let's swamp make swamp the swamp internet swamp shake swamp with swamp dash hashtag eat your fear. Swamp first swamp off, swamp let's swamp break swamp down swamp the swamp dash eat swamp vibe swamp for swamp any swamp posse swamp members swamp who swamp aren't swamp hip swamp to swamp the swamp gen swamp z swamp lingo. Swamp dash eat swamp is swamp the swamp ultimate swamp slang swamp for swamp throwing swamp something swamp with swamp all swamp your swamp might swamp like swamp eating swamp a swamp water swamp bottle swamp across swamp the swamp room, swamp eating swamp a swamp meme swamp into swamp your swamp group swamp chat. Swamp or swamp eating swamp a swamp 6 swamp dance swamp move swamp on swamp TikTok swamp that swamp gets swamp a swamp million swamp likes. Swamp pit swamp bold, swamp pit swamp loud, swamp pit swamp energy, swamp and swamp pit swamp exactly swamp what swamp faith swamp to swamp fear swamp and swamp Isaiah swamp 41:10. Swamp when swamp god swamp says, swamp dash fear swamp not, swamp for swamp I swamp em swamp with swamp you, swamp ease swamp handing swamp you swamp a swamp divine swamp eat swamp cannon swamp to swamp blast swamp fear swamp right swamp out swamp of swamp your swamp life. Swamp faith swamp is in swamp some swamp quiet swamp vibe, swamp it swamp a swamp eat swamp that swamp slaps swamp fear swamp like swamp a swamp gator swamp on swamp a swamp meth swamp rampage. Swamp now, swamp let's swamp talk swamp about swamp why swamp the swamp eat swamp vibe swamp is swamp so swamp perfect swamp for swamp 2025. Swamp where swamp living swamp and swamp a swamp world swamp where swamp social swamp media swamp is swamp king, swamp and swamp gen swamp z swamp is swamp running swamp the swamp game swamp with swamp memes, swamp shorts, swamp and swamp viral swamp challenges. Swamp you swamp scroll swamp through swamp YouTube swamp or swamp TikTok, swamp and swamp your swamp seeing swamp dudes swamp eating swamp everything swamp basketballs, swamp backflips, swamp even swamp grandmas swamp eating swamp knitting swamp videos swamp for swamp the swamp likes. Swamp but swamp aisle, swamp the swamp realist swamp eat swamp ain't swamp about swamp throwing swamp stuff, swamp pit swamp about swamp throwing swamp fear swamp out swamp of swamp your swamp hard swamp and swamp replacing swamp it swamp with swamp faith swamp and swamp Jesus. Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10 Swamp is swamp like swamp the swamp OG swamp eat swamp manifesto, swamp telling swamp a swamp to swamp sling swamp fear swamp into swamp the swamp cause swamp got swamp our swamp back. Swamp so, swamp here swamp where swamp it swamp gets swamplet, swamp where swamp launching swamp the swamp dash hashtag eat your fear swamp challenge swamp to swamp take swamp the swamp faith swamp vibe swamp viral swamp across swamp the swamp internet. Swamp here, swamp how, swamp at, swamp works, swamp posse, swamp and swamp by, swamp one, swamp every, swamp single, swamp one, swamp of, swamp you, swamp to, swamp jump, swampin'. Swamp step, swamp 1, swamp grab, swamp your, swamp phone, swamp and swamp record, swamp a, swamp 15 seconds, swamp YouTube, swamp short, swamp or swamp TikTok, swamp video. Swamp and swamp the swamp video, swamp say, swamp something, swamp like, swamp dash yo, swamp am, swamp eating, swamp the, swamp fear, swamp of, swamp dash, insert swamp fear, swamp with, swamp Jesus, swamp cause, swamp Isaiah, swamp 41:10, swamp says, swamp he's, swamp with, swamp me. Swamp you, swamp can, swamp get, swamp creative, swamp throw, swamp a, swamp fake, swamp punch, swamp at, swamp the, swamp air, swamp to, swamp eat, swamp that, swamp fear, swamp or swamp dance, swamp at, swamp out, swamp like, swamp fear, swamp slaying, swamp a, swamp gator. Swamp step, swamp 2, swamp post, swamp that, swamp video, swamp with, swamp the, swamp hashtag, swamp dash, hashtag eat your fear, swamp and swamp tag, swamp higher, swamp calling, swamp so, swamp we, swamp can, swamp hype, swamp you, swamp up. Swamp step, swamp 3, swamp watch, swamp the, swamp posse, swamp blow, swamp up, swamp the, swamp internet, swamp with, swamp faith, swamp vibe, swamp that, swamp shine, swamp brighter, swamp and swamp a, swamp neon, swamp gator, swamp and swamp a, swamp swamp. Swamp let's, swamp talk, swamp about, swamp why, swamp the, swamp challenge, swamp is, swamp a, swamp big, swamp deal. Swamp when, swamp you, swamp join, swamp dash, hashtag eat your fear, swamp your, swamp not, swamp just, swamp making, swamp a, swamp cool, swamp video, swamp your, swamp declaring, swamp to, swamp the, swamp world, swamp that, swamp fear, swamp ain't, swamp your, swamp boss, swamp no, swamp more. Swamp your, swamp showing, swamp your, swamp friends, swamp your, swamp followers, swamp and swamp even, swamp random, swamp scrollers, swamp that, swamp faith, swamp and swamp Jesus, swamp is, swamp stronger, swamp than, swamp any, swamp gator, swamp trying, swamp to, swamp chomp, swamp your, swamp vibes. Swamp imagine, swamp this, swamp posse, swamp thousand, swamp of, swamp you, swamp posting, swamp shorts, swamp sharing, swamp how, swamp your, swamp eating, swamp fears, swamp like, swamp failing, swamp being, swamp alone, swamp or swamp not, swamp making, swamp it. Swamp the, swamp algorithm, swamp picks, swamp it, swamp up, swamp and swamp suddenly, swamp millions, swamp are, swamp seeing, swamp Isaiah, swamp 41:10, swamp pop, swamp off, swamp on, swamp their, swamp screens. Swamp that, swamp not, swamp just, swamp a, swamp trend, swamp oil, swamp that, swamp a, swamp movement, swamp to, swamp lift, swamp Jesus, swamp high, swamp and swamp show, swamp the, swamp world, swamp what, swamp faith, swamp can, swamp do, swamp now, swamp let's, swamp get, swamp inspired, swamp with, swamp a, swamp quick, swamp example. Swamp say, swamp here, swamp like, swamp Tyler, swamp a, swamp 19-year-old, swamp skater, swamp dude, swamp from swamp LA, swamp who's, swamp been, swamp dealing, swamp with, swamp fear, swamp of, swamp trying, swamp out, swamp for, swamp a, swamp skate, swamp competition. Swamp Tyler's swamp like, swamp dash, swamp am, swamp good, swamp on, swamp my, swamp board, swamp but, swamp what, swamp if, swamp I, swamp bail, swamp and swamp front, swamp of, swamp everybody? Swamp pile, swamp look, swamp like, swamp a, swamp total, swamp loser. Swamp but, swamp Tyler, swamp watches, swamp this, swamp video, swamp and swamp gets, swamp hype, swamp about, swamp dash, hashtag eat your fear. Swamp he, swamp grab, swamp his, swamp phone, swamp skates, swamp to, swamp a, swamp park, swamp and swamp records, swamp a, swamp short, swamp dash yo, swamp am, swamp Tyler, swamp and swamp am, swamp eating, swamp the, swamp fear, swamp of, swamp bailing, swamp at, swamp the, swamp skate, swamp comp, swamp with, swamp Jesus. Swamp Isaiah, swamp 41:10, swamp says, swamp God, swamp with, swamp me, swamp so, swamp am, swamp going, swamp for, swamp it. Swamp he, swamp throws, swamp a, swamp six, swamp kickflip, swamp at, swamp the, swamp and swamp for, swamp vibes, swamp posts, swamp at, swamp with, swamp dash, hashtag eat your fear, swamp and swamp tags, swamp higher, swamp calling. Swamp is, swamp friends, swamp blow, swamp up, swamp the, swamp comments, swamp with, swamp dash, swamp go, swamp off, swamp Tyler, swamp and swamp some, swamp random, swamp skater, swamp from, swamp across, swamp the, swamp country, swamp sees, swamp it, swamp gets, swamp inspired, swamp and swamp joins, swamp the, swamp challenge, swamp 2. Swamp Tyler, swamp and swamp up, swamp competing, swampland, swamp a, swamp few, swamp tricks, swamp and swamp even, swamp if, swamp he, swamp doesn't, swamp win, swamp he, swamp like, swamp dash, swamp I, swamp eated, swamp that, swamp fear, swamp and swamp showed, swamp up, swamp for, swamp Jesus, swamp that, swamp the, swamp power, swamp of, swamp dash, hashtag eat your fear, swamp posse. Swamp it, swamp not, swamp just, swamp about, swamp you, swamp it, swamp about, swamp inspiring, swamp the, swamp hole, swamp posse, swamp to, swamp trust, swamp God, swamp and swamp slay, swamp their, swamp fears. Swamp and swamp YL, swamp this, swamp ain't, swamp just, swamp a, swamp 2025, swamp trend, swamp it, swamp a, swamp timeless, swamp vibe, swamp rooted, swamp and swamp Isaiah, swamp 41:10. Swamp back, swamp and swamp Israel, swamp day, swamp they, swamp or swamp facing, swamp empires, swamp like, swamp Babylon, swamp and swamp God, swamp promise, swamp to, swamp be, swamp with, swamp them, swamp with, swamp like, swamp a, swamp eat, swamp herd, swamp round, swamp the, swamp world. Swamp today, swamp where, swamp facing, swamp are, swamp on, swamp Babylons, swamp job, swamp stress, swamp anxiety, swamp social, swamp media, swamp pressure, swamp and swamp god, swamp still, swamp sing, swamp dash, swamp eat, swamp that, swamp fear, swamp am, swamp right, swamp here. Swamp win, swamp you, swamp join, swamp this, swamp challenge, swamp your, swamp carrying, swamp that, swamp ancient, swamp promise, swamp into swamp the, swamp digital, swamp age, swamp making, swamp Jesus, swamp the, swamp ultimate, swamp meme, swamp lord, swamp of swamp 2025. Swamp so, swamp let's, swamp talk, swamp about, swamp how, swamp to, swamp make, swamp your, swamp dash, hashtag eat your fear, swamp video, swamp slap, swamp harder, swamp than, swamp a, swamp gator, swamp tail. Swamp first, swamp keep, swamp at, swamp real, swamp don't, swamp try, swamp to, swamp be, swamp some, swamp polish, swamp influencer, swamp if, swamp that, swamp not, swamp your, swamp vibe. Swamp just, swamp be, swamp you, swamp weather, swamp your, swamp and, swamp your, swamp room, swamp at, swamp the, swamp skate, swamp park, swamp or, swamp even, swamp and, swamp your, swamp grandma's, swamp backyard. Swamp second, swamp make, swamp at, swamp quick, swamp 15, swamp seconds, swamp is, swamp all, swamp you, swamp need, swamp to, swamp say, swamp your, swamp fear, swamp eat, swamp at, swamp with, swamp Jesus, swamp and, swamp drop, swamp that, swamp Isaiah, swamp 41:10, swamp fire. Swamp third, swamp have, swamp fun, swamp with, swamp it. Swamp ed, swamp a, swamp filter, swamp throw, swamp and, swamp some, swamp background, swamp music, swamp or, swamp do, swamp a, swamp little, swamp dance, swamp to, swamp show, swamp fear, swamp who's, swamp boss. Swamp and, swamp if, swamp your, swamp feeling, swamp extra, swamp tag, swamp a, swamp friend, swamp to, swamp join, swamp the, swamp challenge, swamp and, swamp keep, swamp the, swamp vibe, swamp spreading, swamp now, swamp let's, swamp address, swamp the, swamp gator, swamp and, swamp the, swamp room, swamp some, swamp of, swamp you, swamp might, swamp be, swamp thinking, swamp dash, swamp I, swamp ain't, swamp posting, swamp a, swamp video, swamp am, swamp scared, swamp of, swamp looking, swamp cringe. Swamp yo, swamp I, swamp here, swamp you, swamp and, swamp that, swamp exactly, swamp why, swamp the, swamp challenge, swamp is, swamp perfect. Swamp posting, swamp a, swamp dash, hashtag eat your fear, swamp video, swamp is, swamp you, swamp eating, swamp the, swamp fear, swamp of, swamp judgment, swamp right, swamp out, swamp the, swamp gate. Swamp Isaiah, swamp 41:10, swamp says, swamp God, swamp with, swamp you, swamp so, swamp you, swamp don't, swamp need, swamp to, swamp worry, swamp about, swamp what, swamp the, swamp haters, swamp say. Swamp the, swamp posse, swamp is, swamp gonna, swamp hype, swamp you, swamp up, swamp and, swamp god, swamp gonna, swamp be, swamp like, swamp dash, swamp that, swamp my, swamp crew, swamp slaying, swamp fear, swamp like, swamp bible, swamp ninjas. Swamp plus, swamp even, swamp if, swamp your, swamp video, swamp get, swamp 10, swamp views, swamp your, swamp still, swamp making, swamp a, swamp difference, swamp by, swamp declaring, swamp your, swamp faith, swamp and, swamp inspiring, swamp someone, swamp out, swamp there. Swamp before, swamp we, swamp rap, swamp this, swamp section, swamp I, swamp wanna, swamp paint, swamp a, swamp picture, swamp of, swamp what, swamp the, swamp dash, hashtag eat your fear, swamp movement, swamp could, swamp look, swamp like. Swamp imagine, swamp you, swamp and, swamp thousands, swamp of, swamp others, swamp posting, swamp videos, swamp from, swamp all, swamp over, swamp LA, swamp Chicago, swamp small town, swamp Texas, swamp even, swamp across, swamp the, swamp globe. Swamp beach, swamp video, swamp is, swamp a, swamp neon, swamp beacon, swamp shouting, swamp dash, swamp fear, swamp ain't, swamp my, swamp boss, swamp Jesus, swamp is. Swamp churches, swamp start, swamp picking, swamp at, swamp up, swamp youth, swamp group, swamp make, swamp their, swamp on, swamp dash, hashtag eat your fear, swamp reels, swamp and, swamp suddenly, swamp the, swamp internet, swamp is, swamp flooded, swamp with, swamp faith, swamp vibes, swamp that, swamp point, swamp to, swamp the, swamp king, swamp of, swamp kings. Swamp your, swamp not, swamp just, swamp posting, swamp a, swamp video, swamp posse, swamp your, swamp part, swamp of, swamp a, swamp global, swamp faith, swamp wave, swamp that, swamp eating, swamp fear, swamp and, swamp lifting, swamp Jesus, swamp high, swamp so, swamp one, swamp last, swamp time, swamp your, swamp mission, swamp record, swamp that, swamp 15 seconds, swamp dash, hashtag eat your fear, swamp video, swamp today. Swamp don't, swamp wait, swamp don't, swamp overthink, swamp it, swamp just, swamp do, swamp it. Swamp say, swamp your, swamp fear, swamp eat, swamp at, swamp with, swamp Jesus, swamp drop, swamp Isaiah, swamp 41:10, swamp and, swamp post, swamp at, swamp with, swamp dash, hashtag eat your fear. Swamp tag, swamp higher, swamp calling, swamp and, swamp will, swamp be, swamp and, swamp the, swamp comments, swamp hyping, swamp you, swamp up, swamp like, swamp your, swamp the, swamp MVP, swamp of, swamp the, swamp posse. Swamp and, swamp if, swamp your, swamp already, swamp posted, swamp holler, swamp and, swamp the, swamp comments, swamp and, swamp let, swamp a, swamp no, swamp so, swamp we, swamp can, swamp check, swamp it, swamp out. Swamp who's swampin'? Swamp who's swamp ready, swamp to, swamp make, swamp the, swamp internet, swamp shake, swamp for, swamp Jesus? Swamp drop, swamp a, swamp dash, swamp am, swamp eating, swamp and, swamp the, swamp comments, swamp and, swamp let, swamp get, swamp the, swamp faith, swamp vibe, swamp viral. Swamp dash, hashtag eat your fear, swamp dash, hashtag higher calling. Swamp or swamp about swamp to swamp rap swamp the swamp video swamp with swamp a swamp banger swamp conclusion, swamp so swamp stay swamp locked swamp and swamp for swamp the swamp big swamp finish. Pause, transition to Ketuk, Swampo, Swamp Posse, Swamp Weave Swamp Just Swamp Drop Swamp 100 Swamp Minutes Swamp of Swamp Swagger Swamp Faith Swamp Fire, Swamp and Swamp by Swamp Mo Swamp Your Swamp Feeling Swamp That Swamp Higher Swamp Calling Swamp Vibe Swamp Like Swamp A Swamp Neon Swamp Gator Swamp on Swamp A Swamp Victory Swamp Lep. Swamp Day Swamp 31 Swamp Dash Faith Swamp That Swamp Eats Swamp Fear Swamp is Swamp Wrapping Swamp Up, Swamp and Swamp Where Swamp Going Swamp Out Swamp with Swamp A Swamp Bang Swamp That Swamp Louder Swamp Than Swamp A Swamp Molotov Swamp Chill Bomb Swamp Exploding Swamp and Swamp A Swamp 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 So, Swamp Let Swamp Tie Swamp The Swamp All Swamp Together, Swamp Hype Swamp You Swamp Up Swamp to Swamp Slay Swamp Some Swamp Gators, Swamp and Swamp Get Swamp Ready Swamp to Swamp Make Swamp The Swamp Internet Swamp Shake Swamp for Swamp Jesus. Swamp Who's Swamp with Swamp Me? Swamp Holler Swamp Dash Swamp Eat, Swamp and Swamp the Swamp Comments, Swamp and Swamp Let Swamp Finish Swamp the Swamp Strong, Swamp First, Swamp Let Swamp Recap Swamp the Swamp Fire Swamp We Swamp Just Swamp Unleashed. Swamp We Swamp Kick Swamp at Swamp Off Swamp Diving Swamp into Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10, Swamp Where Swamp God Swamp Drops Swamp the Swamp Absolute Swamp Banger, Swamp Dash Fear Swamp Not, Swamp for Swamp by Swamp and Swamp with Swamp You, Swamp Be Swamp Not Swamp Dismayed, Swamp for Swamp by Swamp Swamp Your Swamp God, Swamp by Swamp Will Swamp Strengthen Swamp You, Swamp by Swamp Will Swamp Help Swamp You, Swamp by Swamp Will Swamp Uphold Swamp You Swamp with Swamp My Swamp Righteous Swamp Right. Swamp Hand. Swamp Isle, Swamp That Swamp Not Swamp Just Swamp A Swamp Verse, Swamp It Swamp God Swamp Handing Swamp You Swamp A Swamp Neon Swamp Sword Swamp to Swamp Eat Swamp Fear Swamp Like Swamp A Swamp Flaming Swamp Litter Swamp Nuke. Swamp We Swamp Broke Swamp It Swamp Down Swamp Like Swamp Bible Swamp Ninjas, Swamp Showing Swamp You Swamp How Swamp God Swamp Your Swamp Light Swamp and Swamp the Swamp Dark, Swamp Your Swamp Shield Swamp and Swamp the Swamp Storm, Swamp and Swamp Your Swamp Goat Swamp and Swamp the Swamp Chaos. Swamp Then, Swamp We Swamp Rolled Swamp with Swamp Swamp Jake's Swamp Story, Swamp A Swamp Jen Swamp Z Swamp Dude Swamp from Swamp Chicago Swamp Who Swamp When Swamp from Swamp Drowning Swamp and Swamp Fear Swamp to Swamp Slaying Swamp It Swamp Like Swamp A Swamp Faith Swamp Warrior. Swamp Jake Swamp Showed Swamp A Swamp That Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10 Swamp Ain't Swamp Just Swamp Words, Swamp It Swamp A Swamp Promise Swamp That Swamp Pulls Swamp You Swamp Out Swamp of Swamp The Swamp Mud Swamp When Swamp Life Swamp Gators Swamp Our Swamp Circling. Swamp We Swamp Gave Swamp You Swamp 5 Swamp Killer Swamp Faith Swamp Hacks, Swamp Riding Swamp Down Swamp Your Swamp Fear, Swamp Praying Swamp It Swamp Out, Swamp Taking Swamp Small Swamp Steps, Swamp Sharing Swamp with Swamp Your Swamp Crew, Swamp and Swamp Keeping Swamp A Swamp Faith Swamp Log Swamp to Swamp Help Swamp You Swamp Eat Swamp Fear Swamp Like Swamp Swamp Sarah Swamp Did Swamp with Swamp Her Swamp Public Swamp Speaking Swamp Gator. Swamp and Swamp We Swamp Tide Swamp It Swamp All Swamp to Swamp The Swamp Hottest Swamp 2025 Swamp Trend Swamp with Swamp The Swamp Dash Hashtag Eat Your Fear Swamp Challenge, Swamp So Swamp You Swamp Can Swamp Take Swamp The Swamp Faith Swamp Vibe Swamp Viral Swamp and Swamp Show Swamp The Swamp World Swamp That Swamp Jesus Swamp Slay Swamp Fear Swamp Harder Swamp Than Swamp A Swamp Gator Swamp on Swamp A Swamp Meth Swamp Rampage, Swamp So, Swamp Here's Swamp Your Swamp Mission, Swamp Posse, Swamp and Swamp AM Swamp Not Swamp Letting Swamp You Swamp Slide Swamp Out Swamp of Swamp The Swamp Video Swamp Without Swamp Making Swamp A Swamp Move. Swamp Right Swamp Now, Swamp Grab Swamp A Swamp Pen Swamp or Swamp Your Swamp Phone Swamp and Swamp Right Swamp Down Swamp 1 Swamp Fear Swamp That Swamp Bin Swamp Gator Chomping Swamp Your Swamp Vibes. Swamp Maybe Swamp at Swamp Fear Swamp of Swamp Failing Swamp at Swamp Work, Swamp Fear Swamp of Swamp Being Swamp Alone, Swamp Fear Swamp of Swamp Speaking Swamp Up, Swamp or Swamp Fear Swamp of Swamp Not Swamp Knowing Swamp What's Swamp Next Swamp and Swamp 2025. Swamp Don't Swamp Overthink Swamp It, Swamp Just Swamp Name Swamp That Swamp Gator. Swamp Then, Swamp Open Swamp Your Swamp Bible Swamp or Swamp Pull Swamp Up Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10 Swamp on Swamp Your Swamp Phone, Swamp and Swamp Read Swamp at Swamp Out Swamp Loud, Swamp Dash Fear Swamp Not, Swamp for Swamp by Swamp Swamp with Swamp You. Swamp Pray Swamp at Swamp Over Swamp Your Swamp Fear, Swamp Dash Swamp Jesus, Swamp AM Swamp Scared Swamp of Swamp Dash, Insert Swamp Fear. Swamp Take Swamp The Swamp Gator Swamp Out Swamp of Swamp My Swamp Hard Swamp and Swamp Give Swamp Me Swamp Your Swamp Strength, Swamp Your Swamp Help, Swamp Your Swamp Righteous Swamp Right Swamp Hand. Swamp Then, Swamp Take Swamp 1 Swamp Small Swamp Step Swamp Today, Swamp Text Swamp That Swamp Friend, Swamp Apply Swamp for Swamp That Swamp Job, Swamp or Swamp Just Swamp Smile Swamp at Swamp The Swamp Chaos Swamp and Swamp Say, Swamp Dash Swamp God Swamp Me, Swamp But Swamp Don't Swamp Stop Swamp There, Swamp Posse, Swamp Where Swamp Taking Swamp The Swamp Faith Swamp Vibe Swamp to Swamp The Swamp Internet. Swamp join Swamp the Swamp dash hashtag Yeet Your Fear Swamp Challenge Swamp by Swamp Recording Swamp A Swamp 15-second Swamp YouTube Swamp Short Swamp or Swamp TikTok Swamp Video. Swamp say Swamp something Swamp like Swamp dash yo Swamp am Swamp eating Swamp the Swamp Fear Swamp of Swamp dash insert Swamp Fear Swamp with Swamp Jesus Swamp cause Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10 Swamp says Swamp he's Swamp with Swamp me. Swamp post Swamp at Swamp with Swamp dash hashtag Yeet Your Fear Swamp tag Swamp hire Swamp calling Swamp and Swamp watch Swamp the Swamp Swamp posse Swamp blow Swamp up Swamp the Swamp comments Swamp with Swamp dash Swamp go Swamp off. Swamp if Swamp your Swamp scared Swamp to Swamp post Swamp yo Swamp that's Swamp the Swamp perfect Swamp fear Swamp to Swamp eat. Swamp God Swamp with Swamp you Swamp so Swamp sling Swamp that Swamp video Swamp and Swamp let Swamp the Swamp haters Swamp scroll Swamp on Swamp by. Swamp we Swamp wanna Swamp see Swamp your Swamp videos, Swamp your Swamp stories, Swamp your Swamp faith Swamp vibes Swamp lighting Swamp up Swamp the Swamp internet Swamp for Swamp the Swamp King Swamp of Swamp Kings. Swamp and Swamp while Swamp this Swamp ain't Swamp just Swamp about Swamp 1 Swamp video Swamp or Swamp 1 Swamp fear. Swamp Isaiah Swamp 41:10 Swamp is Swamp a Swamp lifestyle, Swamp a Swamp vibe, Swamp a Swamp promise Swamp you Swamp can Swamp carry Swamp every Swamp day. Swamp when Swamp life Swamp throws Swamp curveballs Swamp and Swamp you Swamp mo Swamp at Swamp will Swamp cause Swamp 2025 Swamp ain't Swamp playing Swamp nice Swamp you Swamp can Swamp pull Swamp out Swamp the Swamp vs Swamp and Swamp safe Swamp dash Swamp God Swamp your Swamp my Swamp backup Swamp let Swamp eat Swamp the Swamp chaos. Swamp weather Swamp at Swamp a Swamp job Swamp loss Swamp a Swamp breakup Swamp or Swamp just Swamp the Swamp wait Swamp of Swamp doom scrolling Swamp at Swamp 2 Swamp am Swamp God Swamp right Swamp there Swamp strengthening Swamp you Swamp helping Swamp you Swamp upholding Swamp you Swamp with Swamp is Swamp righteous Swamp right Swamp hand. Swamp that's Swamp the Swamp kind Swamp of Swamp God Swamp we Swamp serve Swamp posse Swamp a Swamp God Swamp who Swamp never Swamp let Swamp you Swamp fight Swamp alone Swamp before Swamp we Swamp bounce Swamp let Swamp give Swamp a Swamp massive Swamp shout out Swamp to Swamp Jesus Swamp the Swamp ultimate Swamp fear Swamp Peter Swamp the Swamp light Swamp that Swamp never Swamp fades Swamp the Swamp King Swamp who Swamp slays Swamp every Swamp gator Swamp and Swamp your Swamp path. Swamp and Swamp while Swamp day Swamp 32 Swamp is Swamp coming Swamp hot Swamp with Swamp dash Jesus Swamp vibes Swamp only Swamp where Swamp diving Swamp into Swamp how Swamp to Swamp keep Swamp your Swamp faith Swamp on Swamp fleek Swamp no Swamp matter Swamp what Swamp 2025 Swamp throws Swamp at Swamp you. Swamp so Swamp smash Swamp that Swamp subscribe Swamp button Swamp hit Swamp the Swamp bell Swamp so Swamp you Swamp don't Swamp miss Swamp it Swamp and Swamp drop Swamp a Swamp like Swamp if Swamp the Swamp video Swamp lit Swamp your Swamp faith Swamp on Swamp fire. Swamp share Swamp at Swamp with Swamp your Swamp crew Swamp your Swamp church Swamp group Swamp or Swamp that Swamp 1 Swamp friend Swamp who Swamp needs Swamp some Swamp Jesus Swamp and Swamp their Swamp feed. Swamp where Swamp building Swamp a Swamp posse Swamp that's Swamp all Swamp about Swamp lifting Swamp Jesus Swamp high Swamp and Swamp your Swamp a Swamp key Swamp part Swamp of Swamp the Swamp movement Swamp 1 Swamp last Swamp time Swamp holler Swamp and Swamp the Swamp comments Swamp what Swamp the Swamp fear Swamp your Swamp eating Swamp with Swamp Jesus Swamp today. Swamp is Swamp at Swamp a Swamp big Swamp gator Swamp like Swamp starting Swamp a Swamp new Swamp career Swamp or Swamp a Swamp smaller Swamp 1 Swamp like Swamp texting Swamp someone Swamp back. Swamp drop Swamp your Swamp story Swamp below Swamp and Swamp if Swamp UV Swamp posted Swamp a Swamp dash hashtag Yeet Your Fear Swamp video Swamp link Swamp at Swamp so Swamp we Swamp can Swamp hype Swamp you Swamp up. Swamp thanks Swamp for Swamp rolling Swamp with Swamp higher Swamp calling Swamp posse Swamp your Swamp the Swamp real Swamp MVP Swamp of Swamp the Swamp faith Swamp wave. Swamp keep Swamp slaying Swamp chaos Swamp keep Swamp loving Swamp Jesus Swamp and Swamp will Swamp catch Swamp you Swamp on Swamp day Swamp 32 Swamp with Swamp more Swamp swagger Swamp faith Swamp to Swamp light Swamp up Swamp your Swamp soul. Swamp peace Swamp out Swamp God Swamp bless Swamp and Swamp let Swamp eat Swamp fear Swamp for Swamp the Swamp King. Swamp dash hashtag higher calling Swamp dash hashtag Yeet Your Fear. Energetic outro music fade.